Welcome to the Jones Gallery Lecture Series. I'm Sarah Jones, the curator here at Jones Gallery. We're a contemporary art gallery based in St. John, New Brunswick. Our core mandate is to present work by contemporary Canadian artists, but art history is also important to us, and we think that art history is something that should be accessible and understandable and free for everyone. And that's why we hold public lectures at the gallery and produce videos like the one you're watching today. We're also pleased to announce that the Jones Gallery Lecture Series is now supported generously by the Sheila Hugh Mackay Foundation. Thank you to the Sheila Hugh Mackay Foundation for supporting our efforts in this. And today's video is brought to you by some of our viewers. So I'd like also to thank Frank, Angela, Clint, and Lisa for supporting today's lecture. If you would like to donate and support our efforts in this as well, you can do so at jonesgallery.ca/arthistory. Today's video is the concluding installment in our three-part series on Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And up today, I'll be talking about Leonardo's clever deployment of a relatively new discovery for the Florentine Renaissance, that of linear perspective, and then how he uses it to underscore and move forward the narrative and the composition in a really innovative and compelling way. But just to recap very, very briefly, I would recommend watching the previous two videos, so this one will make sense. But this is, of course, Leonardo, the portrait by his student Francesco Melzi. Leonardo spent a period of about 16, 17, 18 years in the city of Milan, kind of in the middle of his life, under the patronage, more or less, of the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. And it was under Ludovico's patronage and the Sforza patronage that Leonardo received a commission to paint a wall painting. So it's not a fresco, it's a wall painting for various reasons that I discussed in a previous video. Here at the Santa Maria della Grazia, this is a very important church for the Sforza family. And this is the refectory, dining room essentially, where Leonardo painted the Last Supper on the back wall here. And I discussed in previous videos about the condition of the painting, and then Leonardo's kind of innovative and revolutionary treatment of the figures and the psychological intensity that we see here in the composition and in the painting itself. But today I'll be talking specifically about Leonardo's use of linear perspective. So I'm going to step back or step away from this painting for a moment and just explain the context for this and what linear perspective is, and then we'll talk about why it's working so well in this particular painting. So to talk about linear perspective, we need to talk about our man Brunelleschi, Filippo Brunelleschi. There is another video all about Brunelleschi if you're interested in him and his great dome atop the cathedral here in Florence, kind of dominating the Florentine skyline still. Brunelleschi was an architect and an engineer, painter, sculptor, kind of similar to Leonardo, kind of dabbled in all of the various art forms. He was of a generation just previous to Leonardo. So his work Leonardo would have been aware of Brunelleschi's activities and Brunelleschi's projects and ideas. And Brunelleschi, he spent a great deal of time, or spent some time rather, in Rome, kind of mucking about the Roman ruins, and he was looking for a way to capture the engineering or the precision of the ancient Roman architecture in a very precise way, or in a mathematically accurate way. And that to our knowledge, hadn't existed before. I put that kind of caveat in there because it is possible that the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks maybe had a system of linear perspective, but we have no record. We're not exactly sure. Sometimes it looks like they know what they're doing with linear perspective, and other times it doesn't. So it's tricky to say that Brunelleschi he discovered linear perspective, but maybe he rediscovered it. So But just for the sake of this video, we'll say that he discovered it. He was looking, like I said, looking for a way to, again, as an engineer, as an architect, to document what he was seeing in Rome so that he could then deploy those ideas for projects in Florence. And he thought there must be a way to accurately show or to accurately render three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface in such a way that one could do a drawing. Like, say, for instance, Brunelleschi he designed this church of San Lorenzo in Florence. So say if I am a fellow architect or an engineer, and I visit San Lorenzo, and I'm standing in this space, and I have no access to camera technology, right? Is there a way for me to document this on a piece of paper so that I can then take this back to my city and construct a space that would match what I saw in Florence? And that's basically what Brunelleschi determines. He figures out a system, a mathematical system for rendering on a two-dimensional surface a three-dimensional space, or anything three-dimensional, kind of for volumetric, for representing volume, essentially, is what he determines. And if you notice, I'll come back to this, sometimes, my students always point this out when we're talking about medieval artwork, that the spaces look strange. They sometimes look too flat, or like they're tilting towards the viewer too steeply, and that the figures don't seem to fit within the architecture. And what is causing that feeling is the non-usage of linear perspective. And so in a space like this, it's really hard. Kids do this. Kids do not deploy linear perspective, and then you learn it. I think it's usually around grade 9 when they teach you in art class how to use linear perspective. It's like, oh, this is how it works. And everyone goes about drawing cubes in little streets. But you'll notice, say if we were standing in this space here at San Lorenzo, you'll notice how the lines in the church, the lines, when they're receding into the space, they all seem to be kind of converging. So as things, we know this intuitively, that when things are farther away from us, they recede into space and they get smaller, okay? But they do it in a very specific way, in kind of a mathematical way. So before we get to Masaccio, I'll show you just really, really briefly. There are all kinds of videos on the internet about linear perspective, but this will be a 20-second crash course. All right. Essentially, linear perspective is documenting. So here we have the y-axis, that's the vertical axis, the x-axis. How do we accurately show the z? And the z is what's receding into space. That's the volume axis. And how we see this in nature, there's often, there's a horizon line, okay, H. There is a vanishing point on the horizon, vanishing point. Then the z axis, the z lines, have to all converge and meet at the vanishing point. And those lines that move towards the vanishing point are called orthogonals. And they all need to converge in order for it to make, now that didn't, for it to make sense. I'm drawing upside down here. And there is, you notice too that things tend to see the lines, say if this was a road and the lines are getting closer and closer together, there is a way to mathematically measure that. So essentially, Brunelleschi is figuring out that the vanishing point exists, and then how to measure the distance between each one of these little checks so that it actually makes sense. There's a mathematical way to do that, which I won't get into now, but you can find it on the internet. Anyway, linear perspective in a nutshell. The first painting that we know of to deploy Brunelleschi's scheme, or his ideas here, was Masaccio, his painting of the Holy Trinity. This is at a church in Florence as well. What linear perspective does is it renders, like say if we're looking at a two-dimensional, it's a painting on a two-dimensional surface, it makes it gives an illusion of accurate three-dimensionality. So here we have, this is a painting, I won't go into detail, but this is a painting of Christ, and his God is behind him, and he's surrounded by there's other figures. But if you notice the space in behind, the architecture in behind God and Christ, it makes sense to our eyes. We're like, yep, that looks reasonable. And if I was an engineer or an architect, I could probably take measurements from this and I could recreate it wherever in my engineering lab if I wanted to. So the figures make sense within this space. Now, coming back to Leonardo's painting of the Last Supper. Now let's identify the X and the Y and the Z. We'll find the orthogonals because those are the interesting bits. So the X and the Y, that's easy. The X, say for instance, is the table. That's X. The Y would be the table legs or any of the vertical, the vertical lines in the painting. That's the Y. Any of the diagonal lines, if you follow, say for instance, above the head of the disciples, there are these kind of dark squarish kind of geometric designs on the wall. If you follow the tops of those designs, they recede diagonally into the painting. They descend from the top right, top left, down towards the center of the painting. That's an orthogonal line. So that's this, right? And if you follow it, if you just keep extending, you'll see that those lines will meet exactly at the head of Christ. And you'll find other orthogonal lines too in the ceiling. So we have the X, right? The horizontal lines in the ceiling. But then notice the kind of the cross sections, the orthogonals. And again, if you extend them, they will all come down to meet right at the head of Christ. So I'll show you detail. You can probably find the horizon line. The horizon line is usually pretty easy to identify, especially if we can see a horizon. So in this case, we can see the mountains kind of in behind a little bit of a landscape there in behind the head of Christ. That is the horizon. We've identified the orthogonals and the vanishing point. The vanishing point is right at the head of Christ. And so the mathematical or the scientific elements of this painting that render it a perfect illusion of three-dimensional space also function to underscore that narrative or the idea behind the painting, that the most important figure here, the crucial figure, the figure that has made this very serious and somber and startling announcement. All of the lines are moving towards Christ. Our eyes are guided, the viewer's eyes are guided directly first to the head of Christ, and then we move outward from there. It's a very clever deployment of linear perspective. So it's kind of, I find in Leonardo's Last Supper, he's coalescing so many of the ideas of the early Renaissance, and he's adding in other elements that we then see in the work of Michelangelo and Raphael about kind of the gracefulness of the figures and the intensity of the psychological reactions. But that's all combined with the ideas of artists that came before him, like Brunelleschi and Masaccio, and again, kind of their more scientific discoveries. He's pulling it together. And this work really is what signals what's to come in the next phase of the Renaissance. Like I said, in the work then of subsequent artists who come just after Leonardo, so like Michelangelo and Raphael. And there we have it. Thanks for watching.